The distant mountains stood silhouetted against the fading crimson sky as Jackson Blackwood rode toward the small settlement of Redemption Creek. At 45, his weathered face told stories that his lips rarely did. Years as a Union cavalry officer, followed by a decade tracking outlaws across the unforgiving territories of the American West. His sturdy mare kicked up dust along the trail, the animal sensing they were nearing civilization after days in the wilderness. Jackson adjusted his worn leather holster where his Colt Peacemaker rested, a constant companion that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. The settlement emerged from the gathering darkness, a cluster of wooden buildings, oil lamps flickering in windows, the sounds of a piano drifting from the saloon. This place held nothing but painful memories for Jackson. Yet circumstance had forced his return after 15 long years. I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? The whiskey burned pleasantly as it traveled down Jackson's throat, bringing momentary warmth to his tired body. The Golden Nugget Saloon hadn't changed much. Same scratched bar, same hazy air thick with tobacco smoke, same rough crowd of cowboys, miners, and drifters seeking liquid comfort after hard days. He kept his back to the wall, hat pulled low, observing the room through narrowed eyes while remaining inconspicuous. Recognition was the last thing he wanted, especially from anyone connected to the Hargrove family. They believed him long dead, and that misunderstanding had kept him alive all these years. Jackson's gaze settled on a portrait hanging behind the bar. Thomas Hargrove, the cattle baron who controlled everything in this county, the man whose daughter had once been promised to Jackson before everything went to hell. The bartender, a balding man with suspicious eyes, slid another whiskey toward Jackson without being asked. "Don't get many strangers these days," he remarked casually. "What brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" "Just passing through," Jackson replied, his voice a gravelly rumble from years of disuse. "Might do some hunting." It wasn't entirely a lie. He was hunting, just not for game. His quarry was human, responsible for framing him for a murder he didn't commit, for the hanging he narrowly escaped, for 15 years of exile while his name remained cursed in these parts. The bartender seemed satisfied with the answer and moved away to serve other customers. Jackson's attention shifted to a commotion near the Batwing doors as 3 rough-looking men entered, their spurs jingling with each step, guns displayed prominently on their hips. He recognized the leader immediately, Samuel Hargrove, Thomas's youngest son, now grown into a man with the same cruel eyes as his father. Jackson tensed, fighting the instinct to reach for his weapon. Instead, he remained still, watching as Samuel and his companions took seats at a poker table, laughing loudly and intimidating the other players. Jackson finished his drink and stood to leave when the saloon doors swung open again. The piano fell silent as a young woman entered, her presence immediately drawing every man's attention. Though dressed modestly in a simple blue dress, her natural beauty required no embellishment. Her chestnut hair was pulled back, revealing delicate features and intelligent eyes that scanned the room with purpose. Jackson felt his heart stutter as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Elizabeth, Thomas Hargrove's middle child, the one person who had believed in his innocence 15 years ago. She had been barely 16 then, but now stood before him as a grown woman. Their eyes met briefly across the smoky room, and he quickly looked away, praying she wouldn't recognize him beneath the beard and years of hardship. But something in her expression changed, a subtle widening of those familiar eyes, and Jackson knew his prayer had gone unanswered. Morning light streamed through the thin curtains of Jackson's rented room above the livery stable. He'd slept poorly, memories and plans colliding in his mind throughout the night. The town of Redemption Creek appeared different in daylight, busier, more prosperous than he remembered, evidence of Thomas Hargrove's growing empire. Jackson strapped on his gun belt and descended to the street, conscious of keeping his head down as he made his way toward the general store. He needed supplies, and more importantly, information. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, finding the store empty, except for an elderly shopkeeper arranging canned goods on a shelf. "Morning, stranger," the old man greeted without turning. "Help yourself to some coffee, if you're inclined. Just brewed it fresh." Jackson nodded his thanks and poured a cup from the pot sitting atop the pot-bellied stove. The rich aroma, a welcome change from the trail coffee he'd been drinking for weeks. "You selling Winchester ammunition?" Jackson asked, sipping the surprisingly good coffee. The shopkeeper nodded and gestured toward a glass case. As Jackson examined the ammunition, the door opened again, and he instinctively glanced up. Elizabeth Hargrove stood in the doorway, sunlight haloing her figure. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her, and fixed Jackson with a steady gaze. "I knew it was you," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent store. The shopkeeper, sensing the tension, mumbled something about checking inventory and disappeared into the back room. Jackson straightened, abandoning any pretense. "Miss Hargrove," he acknowledged with a slight nod, his hand instinctively drifting toward his holstered weapon. "You've grown up." A sad smile touched her lips as she moved closer. "And you should be dead, Mr. Blackwood. That's what everyone believes, what my father made sure everyone believed. Yet here I stand," Jackson replied, keeping his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. Elizabeth was close enough now that he could see the light dusting of freckles across her nose, could smell the faint lavender scent that brought back memories he'd long tried to bury. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must know what will happen if my father or brothers discover you're alive." Jackson set down his coffee cup, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the wooden counter. "I came back for the truth, Elizabeth. 15 years is a long time to live with a lie hanging around your neck." Her eyes searched his, filled with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite name. "The truth can get you killed here, Jackson. Some things haven't changed." She glanced nervously toward the door. "Meet me tonight at sunset, at the old Miller property. Come alone and be careful. My brother Samuel has eyes everywhere." The abandoned Miller homestead stood on a gentle rise, overlooking a bend in the creek that gave the town its name. The setting sun painted the weathered timber walls gold as Jackson approached cautiously, leading his horse through the tall grass. He'd arrived early, checking for signs of a trap or ambush, but found nothing suspicious. The property had been vacant since Old Man Miller died in the smallpox outbreak 12 years ago. No one wanted land said to be cursed by disease. Jackson tied his horse to a post on what remained of the front porch and stepped inside the abandoned house, floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The interior was largely empty, save for a broken table and chair, dust thick on every surface. He positioned himself near a window where he could observe the approach path, his peacemaker drawn and ready. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before he spotted a rider approaching. Elizabeth, alone as promised, her figure unmistakable even from a distance. She dismounted gracefully and secured her horse beside his, pausing momentarily before entering the house. Jackson holstered his weapon as she stepped through the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dying light. "You came," she stated simply, removing her riding gloves. "I wasn't certain you would." Jackson gestured to the lone chair. "Sit. You're taking a risk being here." Elizabeth shook her head. "We don't have much time. Samuel's men will eventually notice I've left town." She reached into a small satchel and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age. "This is why you were framed. Why my father wanted you dead. It's a deed to the North Valley property, the land where they discovered gold 5 years after you left." She handed him the paper, her fingers brushing against his momentarily. "My father knew about the gold deposits long before anyone else. Your grandfather's land had the richest veins. When you inherited it and refused to sell," Jackson unfolded the document, his grandfather's signature clear at the bottom. "This doesn't explain the murder I was accused of," he said, confusion evident in his voice. Elizabeth's expression darkened. "Mason Fletcher wasn't killed randomly. He was my father's geologist, the one who discovered the gold. He had a crisis of conscience, planned to tell you the truth." She looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. "My brother Robert killed him on my father's orders. Then they used your knife to frame you." The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. Robert Hargrove, the eldest son, the one who'd once called Jackson friend. Your father orchestrated all of it? The trial? The hanging? Elizabeth nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Everything. He needed your land, needed you gone. When you somehow escaped the hanging, he sent hunters after you for months. Eventually, he decided it was safer to declare you dead, to bury the past completely." Night had fallen, the abandoned house now cloaked in darkness as Jackson processed Elizabeth's revelations. She'd lit a small lantern, its glow casting long shadows across the dusty floor. "Why are you helping me?" he finally asked. "Your family." Elizabeth cut him off with a bitter laugh. "My family? My father is a tyrant who's crushed everyone who's opposed him. My eldest brother is a murderer. Samuel is little more than a common thug wearing expensive boots. They've brought nothing but suffering to this town." She moved closer to Jackson, her expression softening. "And you were the only one who ever showed me kindness, who treated me like I had thoughts worth hearing." Jackson remembered the bright-eyed girl who had followed him around 15 years ago, asking endless questions about books and the world beyond Redemption Creek. She'd grown into a woman of substance and courage, risking everything to help him now. "Your father will never face justice through the law," Jackson said quietly. "Judge Parker is still in his pocket, I assume?" Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Along with Sheriff Collins and most of the town council. The gold made him too powerful." Jackson folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Then I'll have to find another way." Elizabeth's hand suddenly gripped his arm. "You can't go against them alone, Jackson. They'll kill you. For real this time." There was genuine fear in her voice, concern that went beyond mere friendship. "I can help you. I know their operations, their weaknesses." Jackson shook his head firmly. "No, I won't put you in danger. Your family may be corrupt, but they're still your blood. If they suspected you were helping me..." The words hung between them, unfinished but understood. Elizabeth stepped even closer, her eyes locked with his. "I stopped caring about their approval long ago. What they did to you, what they've done to this town, it can't stand. The lantern flickered as a sudden breeze swept through the abandoned house. Jackson tensed, his hand dropping instinctively to his holstered peacemaker. "Someone's coming," he whispered, extinguishing the lantern with a quick movement. Darkness enveloped them as he pulled Elizabeth away from the windows, positioning her behind him protectively. Outside, the unmistakable sounds of approaching riders broke the night silence. At least 3 horses, moving at a controlled pace, not galloping, but purposeful. "Samuel's men," Elizabeth breathed, her voice barely audible. "They must have followed me." Jackson weighed their options quickly. The abandoned house offered little protection if the riders were indeed hostile. The rear door led to open ground, too exposed for an escape. Their best chance was the root cellar he'd noticed earlier, a hiding place until they could determine the visitor's intentions. "This way," he murmured, guiding her toward the trapdoor, half hidden beneath an old rug. The cellar was small and damp, the earthy smell of decay filling their nostrils as Jackson quietly lowered the trapdoor above them. Pressed close in the confined space, he could feel Elizabeth trembling against him. "Be gentle. I'm afraid," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. Jackson's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I'll protect you with my life," he answered, the words emerging as a solemn vow rather than mere reassurance. They remained motionless as heavy footsteps creaked across the floorboards above, voices muffled but growing clearer as the searchers moved through the house. "Spread out," a familiar voice commanded, Samuel Hargrove. "She came this direction. Her horse is outside." Another voice responded, "Place looks abandoned, boss. You sure she'd come here?" Samuel's irritated reply was immediate. "My sister's been acting strange for days. Father wants to know what she's hiding, and I aim to find out." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the search continued above them. Jackson held Elizabeth close, both hardly daring to breathe as dust filtered down from the floorboards with each heavy footstep. His mind raced through escape scenarios, each ending with confrontation, something he wasn't ready for, not with Elizabeth potentially caught in crossfire. Finally, the footsteps receded, and Samuel's voice drifted from outside. "Check the creek bed and the old barn. She couldn't have gone far." The sounds of horses moving away brought momentary relief, but Jackson remained tense, suspicious of the apparent departure. "We'll wait," he whispered to Elizabeth. "Could be a trick." She nodded against his chest, her fingers gripping his shirt. In the absolute darkness, other senses heightened. The sound of her breathing, the faint lavender scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his. Feelings long buried stirred within him, complicated by years of hardship and the knowledge that she was still a Hargrove, daughter of his sworn enemy. Dawn was breaking when Jackson finally deemed it safe to emerge from the cellar. His body ached from hours in the cramped space, but Elizabeth had eventually fallen into fitful sleep against his shoulder, trusting him completely despite their circumstances. He gently roused her, helping her climb the ladder back to the main floor. The house stood empty, morning light streaming through gaps in the walls, illuminating disturbed dust and overturned furniture, evidence of the thorough search. Their horses remained tethered outside, apparently overlooked or deliberately left as bait. "They'll be watching the trails," Elizabeth said, pushing stray hairs from her face. "And they'll be watching your hotel room." Jackson nodded, surveying the landscape through a broken window. "We need somewhere safe to regroup, somewhere they wouldn't think to look." Elizabeth's expression brightened suddenly. "I know a place. Old Dr. Whitaker's cabin, north of town. He died last winter, and it's been empty since." "Samuel avoids that area," claims it's haunted after Whitaker predicted his death to his face. The Whitaker cabin stood nestled among towering pines, nearly invisible from the main trail. They'd taken a circuitous route to reach it, doubling back several times to ensure they weren't followed. The small structure appeared undisturbed, dust thick on the porch steps. Inside, medical texts lined crude shelves and dried herbs hung from ceiling beams, remnants of the doctor's practice. He was the only physician who'd treat people regardless of their standing with my father, Elizabeth explained as she lit the small stove. My father called him a witch doctor because he used both conventional medicine and natural remedies learned from the native tribes. Jackson secured the doors and windows before finally allowing himself to relax slightly. "How long before they connect your disappearance to my presence in town?" he asked, watching as she moved comfortably through the cabin, locating tea and cups as if familiar with the space. "Not long. Samuel may be cruel, but he's not stupid." Elizabeth handed Jackson a steaming cup of pine needle tea. "This buys us a day at most. We need a plan." She settled across from him at the small table, shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes despite her determined expression. "The deed alone won't restore your name or bring justice. We need proof of my father's crimes, proof that can't be buried or dismissed." Jackson sipped the bitter tea, considering their limited options. "Your brother Robert actually committed the murder. Would he ever speak against your father?" Elizabeth laughed humorlessly. "Robert drinks himself unconscious most nights, trying to drown the guilt of everything he's done in my father's name. He might be your best chance, if you can get to him alive." She hesitated, then reached across the table to grasp Jackson's weathered hand. "There's something else you should know. The U.S. Marshal's Office has been investigating my father for land fraud. A marshal named Daniel Sullivan has been in town for weeks, posing as a cattle buyer." Jackson's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Federal involvement changes things. If we could get evidence to this marshal—" His planning was interrupted by distant hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Jackson drew his peacemaker and moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. A single rider approached, an older man with gray-streaked hair and the measured movements of someone experienced in dangerous situations. "Doesn't look like one of your brother's men," Jackson whispered. Elizabeth joined him at the window, her shoulder pressing against his arm. "That's him, Sullivan, the marshal." Relief flooded her voice. "But how did he find us?" The marshal dismounted cautiously, scanning the surroundings before approaching the cabin. His hand rested casually near his holstered weapon, not threatening, but ready. "Elizabeth Hargrove?" he called. "Dr. Whitaker's widow sent me. Said you might need assistance." Marshal Sullivan sat at the cabin table, his shrewd eyes assessing Jackson without judgment. "So you're the ghost of Redemption Creek," he remarked, accepting the cup of coffee Elizabeth offered. "Most interesting. I've been building a case against Thomas Hargrove for 8 months, and your name kept appearing in old documents." Jackson remained guarded, years of survival instincts not easily set aside. "How do we know we can trust you?" The marshal reached inside his vest and removed a folded paper, sliding it across the table. "My credentials. And this," he produced a second document, "is a federal warrant for Thomas Hargrove's arrest on charges of fraud, bribery of government officials, and suspected murder." Elizabeth gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. "You've been investigating him all this time?" Sullivan nodded grimly. "Your father's crimes extend beyond this county, Miss Hargrove. He's manipulated land deals across 3 territories, always following the same pattern: frame the rightful owners, seize their property, extract resources. The day passed with intensive planning, Marshall Sullivan revealing the extent of his investigation, while Jackson shared his own story. Elizabeth provided crucial details about her family's operations, security routines, her father's schedule, the location of important documents. As sunset approached, Sullivan laid out their final strategy. Tomorrow night, Hargrove hosts his monthly poker game. Every important man in the county will be there, including Judge Parker and Sheriff Collins. We'll need concrete evidence before then. Documents proving the land fraud and testimony linking Robert to Mason Fletcher's murder. He turned to Elizabeth, his expression grave. "You're the only one who can access your father's study unquestioned. Are you certain you want to do this? Once you take those documents, there's no going back. Your family will know you betrayed them." Elizabeth's chin lifted defiantly. "They stopped being my family the day they framed an innocent man and corrupted everything good in this town." Elizabeth would return to the Hargrove mansion at dawn, explaining her absence as an impulsive riding trip to clear her head. She would locate the incriminating documents in her father's study during the household's midday meal, the only time the room stood empty. Meanwhile, Jackson and Sullivan would confront Robert Hargrove at his private cabin, where he retreated during his increasingly frequent drinking episodes. The plan contained significant risks, but time worked against them. If Samuel connected Elizabeth's disappearance with Jackson's arrival, everything would unravel. "I'll signal from the West Ridge if I succeed," Elizabeth said as they finalized details. 3 lantern flashes at sunset. The night grew late, Sullivan eventually stepping outside to check the perimeter, leaving Jackson and Elizabeth alone in the cabin's main room, the gravity of tomorrow's dangers hanging between them. "If something happens to me," she began softly, but Jackson cut her off. "Nothing will happen. I won't lose you again." Dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold streaks as Elizabeth prepared to depart. She'd changed back into her riding clothes, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, all evidence of her night in hiding carefully erased. Marshall Sullivan had already left to establish surveillance near Robert's cabin, leaving Jackson to say goodbye. They stood beside her horse, the morning air crisp around them, birds beginning their daily chorus in the surrounding pines. "Be careful," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion he'd long thought himself incapable of feeling. "Your father." Elizabeth stepped closer, placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I stopped fearing him years ago," she whispered. Then, with unexpected boldness, she rose on her toes and replaced her fingers with her lips, the kiss brief but conveying volumes. Before Jackson could respond, she mounted her horse in a fluid motion. "Until sunset," she promised, then turned her mount toward town, becoming smaller against the brightening horizon until she disappeared completely. The West Ridge offered a clear view of both the Hargrove mansion and the approach roads from town. Jackson lay prone among scrub brush and rocks, a spyglass trained on the imposing house where Thomas Hargrove had built his empire on stolen land and broken lives. The day had stretched endlessly, each minute passing with excruciating slowness as he watched for any sign of trouble. Marshall Sullivan would be positioned near Robert's cabin by now, waiting for Jackson to join him after receiving Elizabeth's signal. The mansion showed normal activity, servants moving about, occasional visitors arriving and departing. No unusual commotion suggested discovery of Elizabeth's true activities. As the sun began its western descent, Jackson's tension increased. The study window remained visible through his spyglass, but he'd seen no movement there for hours. Had she found the documents? Had she been caught? The possibilities tormented him, until, finally, 3 distinct flashes of lantern light appeared from an upstairs window. Relief flooded through him, immediately followed by renewed urgency. She had succeeded. Now everything depended on Robert's testimony. Robert Hargrove's cabin stood in a secluded clearing 4 miles from the family mansion, a sanctuary for a man increasingly lost to whiskey and regret. Jackson approached cautiously, spotting Marshal Sullivan hidden among trees near the main path. "She got the documents," Jackson whispered as he joined the lawman. Sullivan nodded, his expression grim. "Robert returned an hour ago, alone but heavily armed. He's been drinking. I could hear bottles breaking." He glanced meaningfully at Jackson. "A drunk man with a guilty conscience and a loaded gun makes for dangerous business." Jackson checked his peacemaker, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. "You have the authority here, Marshal. How do you want to handle this?" Sullivan considered briefly. "Direct approach. I'll identify myself as a federal marshal. You stay hidden initially, seeing you might provoke him if he believes you're actually dead. Once I have him calm, you can show yourself. We need his testimony, not his corpse." The confrontation with Robert Hargrove unfolded nothing like they'd planned. The moment Sullivan announced himself as a U.S. Marshal, Robert began firing wildly through the cabin door. "You'll never take me alive," he shouted, his words slurred but his aim dangerous enough that both men were forced to take cover behind a woodpile. "He's too drunk to reason with," Sullivan muttered as splinters flew from a bullet impact nearby. Jackson nodded grimly. "Cover me. I'm going around back." Before Sullivan could protest, Jackson darted toward the rear of the cabin, using trees and gathering darkness as concealment. The cabin's back window stood partially open, an opportunity. With practiced silence, Jackson eased through the opening, finding himself in a small bedroom littered with empty bottles. The sound of continued gunfire from the front masked his movements as he crept toward the main room, where Robert stood silhouetted against the fading light, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. "Hello, Robert," Jackson said quietly, his peacemaker trained steadily on his former friend. Robert Hargrove spun around, nearly losing his balance, his bloodshot eyes widening in terror. "You're dead," he whispered hoarsely, the rifle slipping from his trembling fingers. "They hanged you." Jackson stepped closer, keeping his weapon raised. "Not quite, though not for lack of trying on your family's part." Robert stumbled backward until he hit a chair, collapsing into it. 15 years had ravaged him, his once handsome face now bloated and lined, his expensive clothes disheveled. "You've come to kill me," he stated flatly, no question in his voice, just resigned acceptance. "Finish it then. I've been dying slowly anyway." Jackson holstered his weapon, a calculated risk, and pulled another chair closer. "I didn't come to kill you, Robert. I came for the truth. Tell me about Mason Fletcher. Tell me why you murdered him and let me take the blame." Something broke in Robert Hargrove's expression, a dam of 15 years of guilt suddenly giving way. "Fletcher found the gold on your grandfather's land," he began, voice barely audible. "Father ordered me to silence him before he could tell you. Said it was for the family, for our legacy." He reached with shaking hands for a bottle, found it empty, and let it fall to the floor. I didn't mean to kill him, just scare him. But he fought back, and the knife. Robert's eyes, momentarily clear despite the alcohol, met Jackson's. Using your knife was father's idea. The perfect solution. Eliminate Fletcher. Acquire your land. All in one move. I've hated myself every day since. A noise at the door announced Sullivan's entry, his marshal's badge now prominently displayed. Robert barely glanced at him, lost in painful recollection. "Will you testify to this before a federal judge?" Sullivan asked. "Tell the whole truth about your father's crimes?" Robert laughed bitterly. "What do I have left to lose? My soul is already damned." Night had fully descended by the time they secured Robert's sworn statement, witnessed by Sullivan with official documentation. The broken man sobered somewhat during the process, seeming almost relieved as he detailed years of his father's crimes. When finished, Sullivan handcuffed him, protection rather than punishment. "He's key to our case now," the marshal explained to Jackson. "And Thomas Hargrove won't hesitate to eliminate loose ends, even his own son." They agreed. Robert would remain secured in the cabin, with Sullivan standing guard, while Jackson returned to town to meet Elizabeth at their predetermined location, the church cemetery, at midnight. She would bring the stolen documents, completing the evidence needed to move against Thomas Hargrove during tomorrow's poker game. Jackson mounted his horse, anxiety gnawing at him as he considered the dangers Elizabeth faced. If her theft had been discovered, he pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the careful path through darkened woods that would return him to Redemption Creek undetected. Redemption Creek's small cemetery stood on a gentle hill behind the whitewashed church, ancient cottonwoods casting moon-dappled shadows across weathered gravestones. Jackson approached on foot, having left his horse tethered in a grove half a mile back. The midnight hour had just struck on the church bell as he slipped between markers, alert for any sign of Elizabeth or danger. The agreed meeting place was his grandfather's grave, located in the cemetery's older section beneath a massive oak tree. He moved cautiously toward it, senses heightened, the weight of his peacemaker reassuring against his hip. The grave came into view, but Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. Jackson checked his pocket watch by moonlight. Midnight, exactly. She should be here. Cold dread washed over him as minutes passed with no sign of her. Had something gone wrong? Had her betrayal been discovered? Just as he prepared to search the town, a slight movement caught his eye, a shadow separating from the darkness near the church. "Jackson," Elizabeth's voice called softly as she hurried toward him, a leather satchel clutched tightly to her chest. Relief flooded through him, quickly followed by alarm at her disheveled appearance and the unmistakable tear in her sleeve. "You're hurt," he said, reaching for her. She shook her head, breathless. "No time. Samuel knows. He caught me leaving Father's study. I managed to escape with these." She thrust the satchel into his hands. "Carrying the life, but they're searching the town for me." Jackson opened the satchel briefly, confirming it contained documents and ledgers. "How much time do we have?" Elizabeth glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Minutes at most. Samuel was organizing men when I slipped away. We need to reach Marshal Sullivan immediately." The urgency in her voice compelled immediate action. Jackson took her hand, leading her quickly through the cemetery toward where he'd left his horse. "Stay close," he whispered. "If we're separated, head for Robert's cabin. Sullivan will protect you." They had just reached the edge of town when gunshots echoed behind them, followed by shouting. "There she is!" Samuel's voice carried clearly through the night air. "With a man! Stop them!" Jackson helped Elizabeth mount his horse, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed as he spurred the animal forward, choosing speed over stealth now that discovery was certain. The horse responded admirably, powerful muscles bunching as it galloped down the main street and toward the Eastern Trail. More gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whistling past. Jackson kept his body positioned to shield Elizabeth as best he could while maintaining control of their mount. The hoofbeats of pursuing riders grew louder as they reached the town limits. "They're gaining," Elizabeth warned, her body tense against his. Jackson veered suddenly off the main trail into dense underbrush, a risky maneuver in darkness, but their best chance of losing the pursuit. The horse navigated the difficult terrain valiantly, responding to Jackson's experienced guidance as they crashed through brush and forded shallow streams. Behind them, confused shouts suggested their pursuers had momentarily lost their trail. "There's an old mining road ahead," Elizabeth said between jolts. "It connects to the path near Robert's cabin." Jackson guided their mount in the direction she indicated, eventually finding the overgrown road, barely visible in the darkness, but passable. They rode in tense silence for several minutes, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. Just as Jackson began to hope they'd escaped, a rifle shot cracked from somewhere ahead, startling their horse. The animal reared violently, nearly throwing them both. Jackson managed to control the frightened beast, but not before spotting the source of the shot: Thomas Hargrove himself, mounted on a massive black stallion, blocking the narrow road ahead. Beside him sat Sheriff Collins, rifle raised for another shot. "Elizabeth," Thomas Hargrove's commanding voice carried clearly in the night air. "What disappointment you've brought to our family name." His tone contained no fatherly concern, only cold fury, barely contained beneath a veneer of control. Jackson felt Elizabeth stiffen against him, but admired how she raised her chin defiantly. "The only shame to our name is what you've done, Father. The people you've destroyed." Thomas's attention shifted to Jackson, his eyes narrowing. "Blackwood, so the rumors of your survival weren't exaggerated after all. 15 years, and still you plague me." He gestured to the sheriff beside him. "Collins, arrest this man for the murder of Mason Fletcher and the theft of Hargrove property." The sheriff raised his rifle higher, but Jackson made no move to surrender. Instead, he carefully shifted the reins to one hand, his other moving imperceptibly closer to his holstered peacemaker. "Your crimes are finished, Hargrove. Federal authorities have Robert's confession and your falsified land deeds." Thomas Hargrove's composed facade cracked slightly at the mention of federal involvement. "Robert?" he questioned, genuine surprise in his voice. "My useless, drunken son betrayed me as well?" He laughed suddenly, the sound devoid of humor. "It seems my family disintegrates around me." His hand moved to his own sidearm. "No matter. Dead witnesses tell no tales, and accidents befall federal marshals in these dangerous territories all the time." The standoff teetered on a knife's edge, Jackson and Elizabeth on one horse, facing Thomas Hargrove and Sheriff Collins, each side knowing the next moments would determine everything. The tense silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of multiple rifles being cocked from the surrounding trees. "Thomas Hargrove," Marshal Sullivan's authoritative voice rang out from darkness. "You're surrounded by federal agents. Lower your weapons and surrender peacefully." It was a bluff. Jackson knew Sullivan had come alone, but in the darkness, with tension high, it might work. For a moment, it seemed Thomas Hargrove might surrender. His hand hesitated near his holster as he scanned the darkness, trying to discern if Sullivan's claim of multiple agents was true. But something in the cattle baron snapped. Perhaps the realization that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. Perhaps simple rage that had simmered for 15 years. With surprising speed for a man his age, he drew his revolver and fired at Jackson. The bullet grazed Jackson's shoulder as he simultaneously pushed Elizabeth from their horse and drew his peacemaker. Everything happened in chaotic seconds. Sheriff Collins, firing wildly into the trees where Sullivan's voice had come from. Elizabeth, scrambling for cover. Sullivan, returning fire from his hidden position. Jackson squeezed the trigger of his peacemaker, just as Hargrove aimed for a second shot. His bullet found its mark, striking Thomas Hargrove in the chest. The cattle baron's expression registered surprise before he toppled backward from his saddle, landing heavily in the dirt of the road he'd claimed as his own for so many years. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek, sunlight gradually illuminating a town forever changed. Thomas Hargrove was dead, Sheriff Collins in custody, and federal agents summoned by telegraph the previous evening had arrived to arrest Judge Parker and several town officials implicated in the Hargrove corruption. Jackson stood on the boardwalk outside the telegraph office, having just sent a message to Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, confirming his availability to testify in the upcoming trials. Marshal Sullivan approached, offering a cup of coffee. "Paperwork's nearly complete," the lawman said. "Your name will be officially cleared by week's end. The deed to your grandfather's property is being processed for return to you." Jackson nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. "And Robert?" Sullivan sipped his coffee before answering. "Agreed to testify against everyone involved in exchange for leniency. Given his cooperation and obvious remorse, he'll likely serve a reduced sentence." Jackson accepted this with a slight nod. Justice would be served, though imperfectly, as it always was in this imperfect world. Elizabeth joined them moments later, having finished giving her statement to the federal agents. Despite the exhaustion evident in her features, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "It's over," she said simply, coming to stand beside Jackson. "Father's empire is dismantled. Samuel was captured trying to flee with what money he could gather." Her hand found Jackson's, fingers intertwining naturally. Marshal Sullivan tactfully excused himself, leaving them alone on the quiet morning street. "What will you do now?" Jackson asked, turning to face her fully. The question contained others, unspoken but understood between them. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "The Hargrove name means nothing in this town anymore. There's nothing for me here." She hesitated, vulnerability showing briefly in her expression. "I heard Montana Territory is beautiful this time of year." Jackson felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or a future previously unimagined. "I hear the same," he replied, a rare smile softening his weathered features. "Might be a good place to start fresh." As the morning stage arrived with more federal agents, Jackson and Elizabeth stood slightly apart from the growing commotion in the town center. The truth had finally emerged. 15 years of lies and corruption exposed to cleansing light. Jackson's name would be cleared, his property returned, justice finally served. Not perfectly, but substantially. Yet, as he watched Elizabeth directing agents to remaining evidence at the Hargrove estate, he realized the most valuable thing recovered wasn't land or gold or even his reputation. It was the possibility of what lay ahead, unwritten and full of potential. The road to Montana would be long, the future uncertain, but for the first time in 15 years, Jackson Blackwood looked forward rather than back. Elizabeth returned to his side, her hand finding his once more, as they watched the sun rise fully over Redemption Creek. "Ready?" she asked simply. Jackson nodded, knowing she wasn't just asking about their immediate departure. "With you," he answered, "I am." If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.